The morning the rats left New York City, nobody noticed at first. It wasn't like they packed their bags and abandoned the subway tunnels in an organized exodus. There was no mass migration visible from the streets above, no coordinated retreat that would have made the evening news. Instead, it was the absence of small things, the lack of scratching in walls, the silence where there had always been the patter of tiny claws, the uncanny stillness of the deep places where the city breathes beneath itself. Sanitation workers noticed it within days. The traps came up empty. The bait stations remained untouched. By the end of the first week, even the casual observer could sense something had shifted in the urban ecosystem, a fundamental rebalancing of power and presence that nobody had predicted, and for which nobody was genuinely prepared. Before we continue, if you'd like to join me for more stories like this, feel free to subscribe. I share a new one every day. And if you don't mind, leave a comment and tell me where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I love seeing how far these stories travel. It began, as do most transformations of this magnitude, with a single mistake, or perhaps not a mistake at all, but rather an act of such profound misunderstanding that it would eventually reshape the entire relationship between human civilization and the urban environment. The city's rodent population had thrived for nearly 3 centuries, ever since that first fateful moment when European ships had crossed the Atlantic and deposited their unwilling passengers on the shores of the New World. The rats had arrived as stowaways, hidden in the holds of merchant vessels, emerging into the chaos of colonial settlement like invaders from another world. They brought with them no intention or malice, only the same basic drives that animated all creatures: the drive to survive, to reproduce, to find food and shelter, and build communities. From that first foothold in Manhattan, they had multiplied and spread with a consistency and determination that had, in many ways, rivaled human population growth itself. By the 20th century, the common wisdom held that there were as many rats in New York City as there were people, roughly 8 million souls, both human and rodent, sharing the same islands, breathing the same air, competing for scraps in the accumulated detritus of urban life. The number was likely apocryphal. Nobody had ever conducted a genuine census of the rat population. But the underlying truth was clear. Rats were everywhere, and they were thriving. They had become as much a part of the urban landscape as the buildings themselves, as permanent a fixture as the subway system or the network of streets that carved the city into manageable blocks. Children grew up knowing the sound of rats in the walls. Adults had learned not to leave food out overnight. Restaurants employed specialized exterminators as part of their operational costs, as essential to their functioning as refrigeration or running water. The rats had evolved to thrive in this environment in ways that seemed almost supernatural to those who studied them. They had learned to navigate the subway system with fluency that rivaled that of human commuters, establishing territories and trade routes as complex as any merchant republic. They had developed an almost instinctive understanding of human schedules, of when restaurants would dump their garbage, of which alleys were patrolled by exterminators, and which were safe havens where they could rest and reproduce. They had adapted their behavior to the rhythms of the city until they had become, in many ways, as integral to New York's identity as pigeons or yellow taxis. But by the early part of the 21st century, something had begun to change. The city had embarked on one of its periodic cleaning crusades, those moments of municipal virtue and coordinated effort when the powers that governed decided that enough was enough, that the city had descended too far into filth and disorder, that the rot had gone too deep, and that something dramatic had to be done. Such initiatives had come before, of course. They were part of the rhythmic nature of city governance, the endless cycle of neglect and restoration, decay and renewal, crisis and response. What made this particular crusade different was not its intention, which was familiar enough, but its ambition and its scope. The program was called Clean Streets, and it was backed by a remarkable coalition of interests. There were environmental groups who worried about the ecological impact of rodent waste in the waterways. There were public health officials concerned about disease transmission, about hantavirus and leptospirosis and other pathogens that could jump from rats to humans. There were real estate developers who saw property values dropping in neighborhoods with visible rat populations, who believed that cleaning up the rat problem could unlock vast tracts of the city for profitable redevelopment. There were politicians who believed they could ride the wave of public disgust toward re-election, who understood that the rat problem was one of the few issues that could unite constituencies across traditional political divides. And there were certain animal welfare groups who got involved as well, though their concerns were somewhat different from the others. They wanted the rats controlled humanely, through exclusion and prevention, rather than through extermination or poisoning. They argued that the rats were not evil or vicious creatures, but simply animals responding to the environment that human society had created. These advocates proposed a path that would remove the rats from the cities not through death, but through redesigning the urban environment so thoroughly that it would no longer be attractive to rodents. The program launched with impressive fanfare. Specialized teams in matching uniforms fanned out across the city's 5 boroughs with plans and clipboards and a sense of purpose that hadn't been seen since the great infrastructure projects of the 20th century. They sealed rat holes in building foundations with a fervor usually reserved for natural disaster response, using steel mesh and concrete and industrial sealants to close off every entry point they could find. They upgraded trash receptacles to rat-proof containers in thousands of locations, installing heavy metal boxes with locking mechanisms that required human dexterity to operate. They created educational campaigns warning residents not to feed rodents, though this was primarily targeted at a peculiar subset of the population, usually elderly people, usually in rent-controlled apartments that seemed almost romantically attached to the creatures, that left out rice and vegetables for them, and viewed the rats as companions rather than pests. They deployed ultrasonic deterrents in subway stations, devices that emitted high-frequency sounds that humans couldn't hear, but that were supposedly unbearable to rats. They posted bounties for citizen reports of rat activity, essentially converting the entire city population into an unpaid surveillance force dedicated to tracking and reporting on the movements of rodents. They trained an army of inspectors to enforce new ordinances against improper garbage disposal, and they were willing to levy hefty fines against anyone who violated the rules. The message was clear. The city had declared war on rats, and every citizen was enlisted. For the first year, the program seemed to be working. Rat populations in several neighborhoods dropped by measurable percentages. Sanitation workers reported that the volume of rodent activity appeared to be declining. The frequency of reports of rats in apartments and commercial spaces decreased. Restaurants claimed that their pest control bills were shrinking, that they didn't need to call exterminators as frequently as before. News outlets ran celebratory stories about the success of the initiative, focusing on the dedicated teams and the emerging science of rat control. City officials held press conferences and smiled for the cameras, accepting congratulations for finally addressing one of the most persistent and intractable problems facing urban civilization. The program received funding for a second year, then a third, and seemed likely to continue indefinitely, rolled into the permanent budget of city services the way street cleaning and pothole repair were. But the rats, as it turned out, had other ideas about how the story should unfold. What nobody anticipated, what nobody could have anticipated, because the phenomenon was unprecedented in the documented history of urban rodent populations without precedent in any scientific literature or historical record, was that the successful reduction of the rat population would trigger a behavioral adaptation so profound that it would fundamentally transform not just the rat population itself, but the entire structure of urban life in New York City, and eventually as the pattern spread in cities across the world. The rats had begun to communicate in ways that seemed to defy the conventional understanding of rodent cognition. They weren't using ultrasonic frequencies that only other rats could hear, the language of squeaks and chirps and warning signals that had been documented in countless laboratories. They were using the city itself as a medium of communication, the pipes and walls and underground spaces, the vast network of utility tunnels and subway infrastructure that connected the entire metropolis. Through a process that researchers would later struggle to explain, that would generate countless papers and debates and theories in academic journals, the rat population had somehow developed a form of collective intelligence that transcended individual organisms and individual families. Information about which buildings were becoming inhospitable would spread through the rodent networks faster than humanly traceable, faster than any observable communication system could account for. Warnings about new trap placements would propagate like rumors through the subway tunnels, filtering out to even the most remote rat populations in days rather than weeks. The rats began to move not as individuals driven by personal survival instinct, or as small family groups competing with each other, but as coordinated units responding to collective imperatives that seemed to emerge from somewhere beyond individual decision-making. More remarkably still, and this is where the story becomes genuinely difficult to credit, even now they began to abandon certain territories entirely, not because there was no food or shelter, not because the conditions had genuinely become uninhabitable, but because they seemed to have made a deliberate choice. The most educated rats, it appeared, the ones with the longest memories and the keenest problem-solving skills, the survivors of multiple generations of conflict with human pest control efforts, these rats were leading the others. Through means that remained mysterious and were never fully explained, they communicated to the others that staying in the city was no longer viable, that the terms of coexistence had shifted irrevocably, that survival itself required a strategic retreat. It was as if the rat population had voted democratically and collectively, with some kind of consensus mechanism that made decisions binding on the entire population. The most educated rats had recognized something that others might not have, that human civilization was committed to their removal, and that the resources arrayed against them would only increase. Rather than fight to the bitter end, rather than stay and be picked off one by one as they were caught in increasingly sophisticated traps or poisoned by increasingly potent baits, the rats had simply decided to leave. The first evidence of this came from subway workers, who occupied a peculiar niche in the urban ecosystem, spending their working lives in the tunnels and stations more familiar with the rat population than perhaps any other group of humans. They noticed that the rats were no longer fighting for territory in the tunnels, that there were no longer the daily territorial disputes that had characterized rodent social life underground. There was an absence of the small corpses that usually accumulated, the mice, and rats that had lost territorial disputes, been caught in traps, or simply failed to survive in the harsh underground environment. The subway stations became eerily peaceful. People who had grown accustomed to the constant presence of rodent life, to the occasional glimpse of a rat running along the third rail or disappearing into a crevice, began to notice the quiet and wonder if they were imagining the change. Then the reports started coming in from other cities: Chicago, Boston, Philadelphia, Los Angeles, San Francisco, Washington, D.C., Baltimore, Detroit. In city after city, rat populations were declining in the same manner, not dying off from increased pest control efforts, not succumbing to some new disease or toxin, but systematically retreating as if in response to some coordinated plan that extended across the entire continent. Wildlife biologists were baffled. Epidemiologists questioned the data, suspecting methodological errors or changes in how communities were conducting their surveys. University researchers launched investigations, trying to figure out if something was being measured incorrectly or if the statistics were somehow an artifact of changes in reporting methodology or funding allocation. Was it possible that pest control had always been this effective, and that people were only now noticing the results? Could there be some selection bias in which cities were being monitored? But by the time the pattern became undeniable, the rats were already mostly gone from the urban centers. They had left the cities and migrated toward less developed areas. Some headed for the agricultural regions surrounding metropolitan areas, the countryside that ringed the great cities like a halo. Others pushed deeper into rural spaces, into areas that had been depopulated by rural exodus, into towns and villages that had been abandoned or that had shrunk to a fraction of their former size. A few populations even seemed to be heading toward genuinely wild territories, the forests and wilderness regions that lay beyond the reach of dense human habitation, the state and national parks, and the vast forests of the Northeast and the West. It was as if the rat population had made a collective decision that the cities had become untenable and that the species would be better served by returning to a more traditional ecological niche, by reverting to some ancestral form of existence that didn't rely on the scraps and spillage of human civilization. The immediate human response was jubilation mixed with profound confusion. The victory had been won without sacrifice or struggle, without the ongoing expenses and efforts that had been required before. The enemy had retreated without a final battle. Nobody had to do anything differently or make any extraordinary effort. It was as though the problem had simply solved itself. News outlets struggled to explain what had happened, cycling through various theories and hypotheses. Had the pest control measures actually been more effective than anyone realized? Was there some disease in the rat population that had caused them to flee, some pathogen that had decimated their numbers? Had some environmental factor shifted that made cities suddenly inhospitable? Had an unknown toxin entered the rat food chain? The truth, when it finally emerged, came from an unexpected source. A researcher at Columbia University named Dr. Amira Hassan had been studying rat cognition for nearly 20 years. She had published numerous papers on the problem-solving abilities of rodents, on their capacity for memory and learning, on the sophistication of their social behaviors, and their ability to cooperate with each other. When the rats began to leave, Dr. Hassan became obsessed with understanding why, with following the trail of behavioral evidence and trying to piece together what had actually happened. She began interviewing sanitation workers, subway employees, building superintendents, exterminators, and anyone else who had close and regular contact with rat populations. She reviewed trapping records going back decades, looking for patterns and trends and anomalies. She consulted with animal behaviorists and neurobiologists and experts in collective animal behavior and the emerging field of animal consciousness studies. What she eventually theorized, and what her subsequent research suggested, was not merely possible, but plausible. Even likely was that the rat population had undergone something analogous to a cultural shift, a change in the collective understanding of what was possible and what was necessary. The rats that had survived in the cities over the previous decades had been subjected to unprecedented pressure from the moment the Clean Streets program had begun. They were being hunted with methods both traditional and technological, both crude and sophisticated. They were living in an environment that was becoming increasingly hostile and less predictable, where the ground beneath their feet could suddenly shift and where traps might appear without warning. They were navigating through walls where the entry and exit points were being systematically sealed. They were living in a space where the food supply, once abundant and consistent, was being restricted through better waste management and sealed containers. The shelters they relied on were being sealed and eliminated. The conditions that had made the city a suitable habitat for rodents were being systematically dismantled, piece by piece, trap by trap, sealed hole by sealed hole. In response, the most intelligent rats, those with the best survival records and the keenest problem-solving abilities, the alpha individuals and the matriarchs who led their communities, had apparently come to a conclusion. They were losing. Not gradually or in the long term, not in some distant future if conditions continued to deteriorate, but imminently and definitively. The city was no longer a viable home. The situation would only worsen. Staying would result in death or capture. Leaving wasn't a retreat or an admission of defeat in any meaningful sense. It was a strategic adjustment to new circumstances, a pragmatic recognition of reality, a choice to survive rather than to perish in a war they couldn't win. And somehow, through whatever mechanisms of communication and influence existed within, the rat population, whether through chemical signals or social demonstration or some form of communication that humans hadn't yet learned to detect, this conclusion had spread throughout the species. It had propagated like an idea, like a meme, like something that made sense to individual rats, even if they hadn't personally experienced the pressures that had driven the most educated rats to this conclusion. Enough of the population had decided to follow that a general exodus became possible. Dr. Hassan published her findings in a prestigious journal devoted to animal behavior. The paper attracted international attention and considerable skepticism. It suggested that rats possessed a form of intelligence and collective decision-making, capacity that was far more sophisticated than anyone had previously understood or credited to rodents. The implications were staggering and profound. If rats could reach collective decisions about major strategic questions and communicate them throughout a population of millions, spanning entire continents, then they were operating at a level of sophistication that fundamentally challenged how we understood animal cognition. If rats could do this, what other abilities might they possess? What other non-human animals might be capable of this kind of coordinated thinking? The paper sparked intense debate in the scientific community. Some researchers found her conclusions overreaching, speculative, going beyond what the data could actually support. They argued that there were alternative explanations for the rat exodus, that it was premature to attribute it to collective decision-making and intelligence. Others began conducting their own studies to verify her claims, to test her hypothesis, to try to understand the mechanism by which rats might communicate at such a scale. Universities competed for funding to establish research centers devoted to understanding how the rat population had reached its collective decision to leave. The story became a strange kind of cultural phenomenon. The rats that had left the cities had acquired a mystique, a sense of intentionality, that transformed them from mere pests into something more like conscious agents making deliberate choices about their lives and futures. But while scientists debated the mechanisms and philosophers pondered the implications, the cities themselves were changing in more concrete and immediate ways, ways that could be measured and quantified, ways that affected human lives directly and palpably. The absence of rats created a vacuum, not just ecological, but social and psychological as well. For centuries, rats had been woven into the fabric of urban existence in ways both explicit and implicit. They were the object of repeated campaigns and crusades. They were the villains in countless stories and folklore. They were the symbol of urban decay and disorder, the visible marker of a civilization in decline. They were what people worried about, what kept them awake at night, what made them careful about where they left food, or what pipes they allowed to fall into disrepair. The contemporary American city had been built partly in response to the rat problem, or at least, rat management had been one of the factors that shaped urban development. Zoning regulations, building codes, sanitation requirements, the entire infrastructure of urban governance, all existed partly because of the need to manage rodent populations and prevent them from overrunning the urban fabric. The rat had been such an integral part of the urban condition that its absence became immediately noticeable in ways that went far beyond simple practical considerations. The economic implications were the first to be systematically studied. The pest control industry, which had been generating nearly $2 billion annually in revenue across the United States, suddenly faced an existential crisis. If rats were no longer present in cities, if they had abandoned the urban centers and showed no signs of returning, then the fundamental rationale for large portions of the pest control business had evaporated. Companies that had specialized in rodent control faced bankruptcy. Exterminators found themselves without clients, their specialized knowledge suddenly valueless. The industry attempted to adapt by shifting its focus toward other pests, cockroaches, bedbugs, ants, but these were far less lucrative targets and far less effective in generating the kind of fear-based demand for services that the rat problem had always generated. More unexpected was the impact on real estate values. Properties in neighborhoods where rat problems had been severe suddenly became more attractive and desirable. The visible marks of urban blight that had been attributed to rat activity, the gnawed walls, the visible droppings, the infrastructure damage, all of these began to disappear as the rats themselves disappeared. Rents began to climb in these neighborhoods. Previously marginal areas, the places where nobody wanted to live because of the rodent problem, suddenly became desirable. The removal of the rat problem, paradoxically, made many working-class neighborhoods vulnerable to displacement as property developers. And speculators recognized that conditions were now favorable for more intensive development and more affluent occupancy. The irony was bitter. The neighborhood residents who had suffered under the rat plague were now being driven out by the prosperity that followed the rat's departure. The psychological impact was harder to quantify, but perhaps more profound in its way. Urban residents reported feeling a genuine sense of relief at the absence of rats. The constant low-level anxiety about encountering rodents seemed to have dissipated, lifting like a fog that had been present so long that people had forgotten to notice it. Parents felt more comfortable allowing children to play in parks and playgrounds, to explore the urban environment without the worry that they might encounter a rat or be bitten or exposed to disease. Shopkeepers reported that customers lingered longer in stores, seemed more relaxed and comfortable, were willing to spend more time and money in spaces that no longer felt infested or contaminated. The general sense of urban unease that had been partially attributable to the presence of rats seemed to have lifted, leaving behind a city that felt cleaner and safer and more hospitable. But there was also something else, a kind of loss, a sense of something important having been taken away. The absence of the rat problem meant the absence of a shared struggle, a common enemy that had given urban residents a sense of collective purpose and common cause. The crusades against rats had been something almost ritualistic, a way of affirming shared values and taking action against disorder. Without this enemy, the cities felt somehow less defined, less purposeful, less tied together by common struggle. Some people actually missed the rats in a strange and counterintuitive way. They missed having something to fight, something external that could be blamed for urban problems. Philosophers and cultural critics began publishing essays about what the absence of rats meant for urban identity. Was the city still the city without rats? Had something fundamental been taken away along with the rodents? Some artists began creating installations and performances memorializing the departed rats, treating the event almost as a kind of urban tragedy. There was a strange romanticism that attached itself to the idea that the rats, in leaving, had been making a statement, had been exercising a form of agency and preference that human society had generally denied to them. They had voted with their feet or their paws, rejecting the urban environment that had been shaped around their control and eradication. Meanwhile, the practical benefits of the rat absence were accumulating and becoming increasingly visible. Public health officials noted that the incidence of certain disease vectors, diseases that could be transmitted by rats, began to decline. The specific pathogens that had been circulating through the rat population for generations, hantavirus and leptospirosis and others, were no longer being transmitted to human populations at significant rates. Restaurants found they could reduce their pest control expenses significantly, which translated into lower operating costs and, theoretically, lower prices for consumers. Though in practice, of course, many restaurant owners simply pocketed the savings rather than passing them on. The condition of the subway system began to improve noticeably. With rats no longer gnawing on cables and electrical systems, the number of infrastructure failures attributable to rodent activity dropped dramatically. The Metropolitan Transportation Authority, which had been spending millions of dollars annually on rodent-related repairs, on patching the damage that rats had done to the infrastructure, suddenly had those resources available for other purposes. They could reinvest in station improvements or infrastructure upgrades rather than spending the money on constant repairs. Subway workers reported that their jobs had become somewhat less unpleasant without the constant presence of rats in the tunnels, and station areas without the need to navigate around droppings or manage the fear of being bitten or infected. But as the months passed and the rat absence became normalized rather than remarkable as the initial jubilation wore off and was replaced by a kind of ordinary acceptance that the rats were simply gone, a more complex picture began to emerge. The cities, it turned out, hadn't been as dependent on the problem of rats as anyone had realized, but there were still fundamental issues that remained, issues that had been masked or obscured by the dominant rodent problem. The infrastructure that had been built to combat rats still existed. All those sealed containers and upgraded waste management systems, all that reinforced construction designed to keep rodents out, all those barriers and traps and deterrents, these remained in place, consuming resources and attention, even though the original problem had been solved. Municipal budgets that had allocated resources for pest control had to find new uses for those funds, and the transition wasn't always smooth. Some cities found themselves with suddenly underutilized infrastructure that nobody quite knew what to do with. More significantly, the absence of rats revealed how many other urban problems had been masked or overshadowed by the dominant rodent issue. Homelessness, poverty, inadequate housing, failing schools, contaminated water systems, environmental racism, inequitable access to resources. These issues had always been present in cities, but they had been partially invisible under the more dramatic and more frequently discussed problem of rats. Without rats to focus on, the cities had to confront these other challenges more directly. The rhetoric that had been deployed against the rat problem, the language of invasion, contamination, plague, disease, couldn't be so easily deployed against homeless people and poor communities. The infrastructure that had been built to exclude rats didn't help address the structural inequalities that shaped urban life. The attitude toward urban cleanliness also underwent a subtle shift. The intense focus on eliminating rats had created a particular mindset about what cleanliness meant. It meant eradication, elimination, the removal of living things that didn't belong. It meant sterilization, the absence of all life forms that humans hadn't explicitly chosen to have present. But as that particular threat receded, many city planners and environmental advocates began questioning whether such a relentless pursuit of sterility was actually beneficial, whether it was actually necessary, whether it might even be counterproductive in some ways. This was particularly true in regards to the relationship between urban cleanliness and nature more broadly. The aggressive pest control that had been targeting rats had also affected other animal populations in ways that were only becoming visible now. The populations of wild birds that fed on rats and their offspring had initially declined as their primary food source disappeared. But then they had adapted, beginning to thrive on insect populations instead, on the abundance of small creatures that had been suppressed by the predatory presence of massive rat populations. The ecology was rebalancing in real time, adjusting to new conditions, creating new equilibria. Some researchers noticed that the elimination of rats seemed to be creating space for a more diverse ecology. Instead of a few dominant species, rats, pigeons, cockroaches, the urban environment was beginning to support a wider variety of life. Native birds that had been largely absent from cities were beginning to return. Insects that had been suppressed or extirpated were recolonizing urban spaces. Plants that required particular pollinators or dispersal methods were finding their way back. The cities, in the absence of the rat problem, were beginning to rewild themselves. A movement began to emerge among urban planners and environmental advocates toward what became known as the ecological urbanism movement. The idea was to create cities that embraced a degree of natural ecology rather than attempting to sterilize urban spaces entirely. Instead of viewing every plant and animal not explicitly welcomed by humans as a nuisance to be eliminated, the new approach was to integrate natural systems into urban design, to work with ecological processes rather than against them, to create spaces where both humans and non-humans could flourish. Parks began to be redesigned, not just for human recreation, but to provide habitat for native species. Instead of manicured lawns and ornamental plantings, parks began to include native vegetation communities that could support local birds and insects. Green corridors were established to allow wildlife movement through the city, creating pathways where creatures could move from one habitat patch to another without having to cross dangerous roads or navigate hostile urban spaces. Restrictions on which plants could be grown in public spaces were relaxed to encourage native vegetation. Rooftops began to be covered with gardens, both decorative and productive, creating green space where there had been barren asphalt and tar. The city started to acknowledge that they could incorporate nature rather than existing in constant opposition to it. The transformation didn't happen uniformly or without resistance. Some residents objected to the appearance of insects and wild plants in urban spaces, viewing them as disorder or failure of maintenance. Some traditional exterminators resisted the new philosophy, viewing it as a rejection of public health principles that they had spent their careers defending. There were debates about whether allowing nature to flourish in cities would lead to new pest problems or disease vectors. Would mosquitoes proliferate if standing water was allowed to accumulate for ecological purposes? Could allowing wild vegetation mean the return of rodents or other unwanted creatures? The process was messy and complicated, involving compromises and setbacks. But slowly, visibly, the character of many cities began to change. Green spaces expanded, biodiversity increased. The constant assault on the non-human urban environment began to ease. And parallel to this ecological transformation, something else began to happen in the human experience of the city. The absence of rats, combined with the gradual rewilding of urban spaces, created a subtle psychological shift. People began to spend more time outdoors. Parks that had been viewed primarily as places to pass through quickly, as transit corridors or spaces where one had to stay vigilant about rodents and contamination, began to become destinations for lingering. People sat on benches for longer periods. Children played more freely. Adults began to notice birds and insects and plants in ways they hadn't before. The quality of life indicators that cities used to measure public well-being began to improve. Mental health metrics showed positive trends in many urban areas. Studies suggested that exposure to even limited amounts of natural systems in urban environments had measurable positive effects on human psychology and health, reducing stress and depression and increasing overall life satisfaction. Some researchers began to theorize that the rat problem had been serving a psychological function in the cities, despite being recognized primarily as a nuisance or hazard. It had given people something to struggle against, a concrete external problem that could be addressed through collective action. Its absence created a space for people to reassess what they actually wanted from urban life. What a good city might look like when freed from the constant crusade against urban decay and rodent infestation. It created room for imagination, for envisioning cities differently, for asking what cities could be if they weren't primarily organized around the management of filth and disorder. A decade after the rats left, New York City had transformed in ways both subtle and profound. The population remained roughly the same. The economy continued to function according to the same basic principles. The streets still ran in the same patterns. The buildings still stood where they always had. The fundamental infrastructure remained unchanged. But the texture of daily urban life had shifted. Neighborhood parks hosted community gardens and native plant species that had been absent for decades. The air quality had measurably improved partly because fewer resources were being dedicated to pest control chemicals that had been spread throughout the environment, but also because the re-wilding of urban spaces had increased the plants available to filter and process air. Waterways that had been severely degraded began showing signs of recovery. Fish populations rebounded. Native freshwater mussels began to reappear in rivers that hadn't seen them for a century. And perhaps most remarkably, the human relationship with the concept of urban cleanliness had fundamentally altered. The obsessive pursuit of sterility and the elimination of all unwanted organisms had given way to a more nuanced understanding of what cleanliness actually meant. It wasn't the absence of all life, but rather the presence of functional systems that kept spaces sanitary without demanding the total eradication of all non-human life. Food waste was managed through composting and controlled decomposition, rather than simply being sealed away in disposable containers. Insects were controlled through natural predation and biological management rather than chemical bombardment. The cities had learned to function more as ecosystems and less as sterile machines. The transformation wasn't uniform across all cities, and it wasn't without problems. Some cities embraced the new environmental urbanism more enthusiastically than others. New York and San Francisco, and a few other coastal cities and university towns, became leaders in the movement. Other cities, particularly those in regions with more conservative political cultures or stronger industrial traditions, were slower to adapt. Some neighborhoods struggled with the transition, particularly those with the most severe rodent infestations that had taken the longest to clear. There were setbacks, a few instances where disease vectors did manage to establish themselves in the re-wilded urban spaces, requiring adjusted management practices. There were parks that had to be redesigned after bird populations attracted by native plantings caused problems for adjacent properties. But the overall trajectory was clear. The absence of rats had created an opportunity for urban transformation that few people would have predicted or, in the before times, would have wanted. Perhaps the most significant change was in how people thought about problems and solutions more broadly. The rat crusade had been based on a particular philosophy that had dominated post-industrial Western thinking. Identify a problem, mobilize resources, deploy technological and organizational solutions to eliminate it completely. This approach had succeeded in removing rats from cities, but it had also created a particular kind of urban dystopia, a relentless combat against nature, a refusal to accept any life forms that didn't serve human purposes, an insistence on control and sterility at any cost. The post-rat cities, by contrast, began to explore a different approach to problem solving. Instead of automatic elimination, the first question became, how can we coexist? Instead of technological dominance, the question became, what can we learn from natural systems? Instead of viewing urban space as something to be conquered and controlled, the question became, how can we design cities that incorporate both human and non-human life? These weren't trivial shifts in perspective. They had practical implications for how cities were designed and governed. This philosophy had implications far beyond the specific question of rodent control. It began to influence how cities approached transportation problems, housing shortages, economic inequality, and environmental challenges. There was a recognition that many of the intractable urban problems existed partly because of the particular approach to urban design and management that had been dominant in the 20th century. A different approach, one that incorporated observation, adaptation, and coexistence rather than absolute control, might be more effective in addressing complex urban challenges. Urban economists noted that cities that had embraced ecological urbanism began to attract new residents and new investment. Tech workers and artists, and young professionals who had previously fled to suburbs wanted to live in cities that had green space and nature and biodiversity. Suddenly, the presence of birds and insects and native plants was becoming a draw rather than something to be eradicated. Real estate values appreciated not because of gentrification alone, but because people genuinely preferred living in cities that had integrated natural systems. The cleanliness of a city was no longer measured purely by the absence of dirt and vermin, but also by the presence of healthy ecological systems. The story of the rats also had enormous implications for how humans understood animal intelligence and agency more broadly. Dr. Hassan's research had sparked a broader scientific inquiry into animal cognition. Universities competed to fund research centers investigating not just rat intelligence, but the intelligence of numerous species that had been dismissed as mere pests or creatures of mere instinct. What began to emerge was a far more complex and nuanced understanding of how non-human animals think, communicate, and make decisions about their lives and futures. Researchers documented problem-solving abilities in crows that rivaled primates. They documented sophisticated tool use in octopuses and other invertebrates. They found evidence of planning and foresight in animals ranging from squirrels to dolphins. They discovered that emotional capacities were far more widespread in the animal kingdom than had been assumed. The simplistic model of animal behavior as pure instinct, as mechanical responses to environmental stimuli, gave way to a more sophisticated understanding of animal cognition that acknowledged the possibility of consciousness, intention, and agency in species across the phylogenetic tree. This had ethical implications that rippled throughout society. If rats could make collective decisions and communicate complex information through their populations, then perhaps they deserve some consideration of their agency and preferences. Perhaps the long history of attempts to eradicate them entirely was less justified than had previously been assumed. Perhaps there were more ethical ways to manage the coexistence of humans and rats than absolute elimination had allowed for. Animal rights advocates seized on these ideas and developed them into a more sophisticated argument about how humans should interact with non-human animal populations. The old binary of either complete eradication or absolute toleration gave way to a more complex understanding of management, coexistence, and mutual respect. It was still acceptable to prevent rats from accessing food stores or living in human habitations, to exclude them from spaces where their presence would interfere with human activity. But it was increasingly seen as unethical to pursue their complete elimination or to torture them through crude and inefficient means of control. This philosophical shift had particular resonance in cities, where the tension between human and non-human life was most acute and most visible. If cities could transform their relationship with a creature as traditionally despised as the rat, what other transformations might be possible? Could cities accommodate wild birds and bats despite the challenges they sometimes presented? Could urban spaces include habitat for pollinators and other insects that were crucial to ecological function? Could the very concept of the city be reimagined to be less hostile to non-human life? These questions led to what became known as the Rewilding Cities movement. Urban planners, architects, and environmental advocates began designing cities not just for human habitation, but as habitat for a diversity of life. Rooftop gardens transformed skyscrapers into vertical forests, with plants cascading down the sides of buildings, birds nesting in specially designed spaces, insects pollinating flowers that had been absent from cities for generations. Abandoned industrial spaces were converted into wetlands and grasslands, places where ecological succession could take place, where nature could return after decades or centuries of exclusion. Culverts that had been straightened and buried were restored to allow for natural water flow and aquatic ecosystem function. Daylighting projects restored streams that had been channeled underground, creating habitats for fish and other aquatic creatures. The very structure of cities began to shift to accommodate non-human life in ways that would have seemed impossible before the rats left. Not everyone welcomed these changes. There was genuine resistance from multiple quarters. Some people viewed the rewilding of cities as impractical or dangerous, as a regression to some primitive state. There were concerns about disease transmission, about the reintroduction of pests and parasites, about whether allowing nature to flourish in cities might create conditions that would lead to new problems. Some worried that the focus on environmental restoration was diverting resources from human needs, from addressing housing crisis and poverty and inequality. Some traditional exterminators resisted the new philosophy, viewing it as a rejection of the public health principles they had spent their careers defending and promoting. There were debates about whether allowing nature to flourish in cities would lead to new pest problems or unexpected disease vectors. These concerns weren't entirely without merit, and they required serious engagement and response. There were instances where wetland restoration projects attracted mosquitoes, requiring adjusted management approaches. There were cases where native plants attracted insects that caused problems for nearby residents. There were neighborhoods where the transition to ecological urbanism happened too quickly and created genuine practical difficulties. But the general trajectory was clear. The post-rat cities were becoming places where humans and non-humans shared space in ways that had been unimaginable in the pre-rat absence era. A quarter century after the rats had left, the transformation was largely complete in the major cities that had embraced the new philosophy most enthusiastically. New York City had become a model for what this kind of urban transformation could look like. The subway system, no longer plagued by rats, had been further enhanced with green spaces and design elements that acknowledged the presence of the natural world. Stations were redesigned with native plantings, with seating areas that overlooked ecological restoration projects. Parks had multiplied and expanded throughout the city. The number of trees planted had tripled. The waterways of the city, once severely degraded by pollution and industrial use, had begun to recover in measurable ways. The Hudson River, which had been essentially dead for decades, began to show signs of ecological recovery. Fish populations that had been absent for generations returned. Oyster reefs, which had been a crucial part of the pre-industrial ecology of New York Harbor, began to be restored through specialized restoration projects. The East River, which had been an open sewer for much of the industrial era, began to gradually recover as pollution controls became more effective and as ecological restoration projects began to have their effects. Native mussels began to reappear in the water. People began to swim in rivers and harbors that had been considered too polluted to even touch. More remarkably, the quality of life for human residents had improved in measurable ways. The stress and anxiety associated with urban existence had decreased according to the various psychological measures that researchers used. Mental health outcomes had improved. Community engagement had increased as people spent more time in public spaces. The parks were crowded on weekends with people from all neighborhoods and all socioeconomic backgrounds. Crime rates in parks decreased as they became more populated and more welcoming. Real estate values had stabilized and then appreciated more fairly, without the artificial spikes that had occurred during the transition period when gentrification pressure had been most intense. The cities, it turned out, were more pleasant places to live when they stopped trying to be completely sterile and accepted a degree of wildness within their boundaries. But perhaps the most significant change was in how people understood their relationship to the natural world and to the other creatures that shared their spaces. The rats, by leaving, had forced a reckoning. They had revealed that there was an alternative to the binary choice of either tolerating a pest species completely or attempting to eradicate it entirely. They had demonstrated that non-human animals possessed more intelligence and agency than had been previously credited to them. They had revealed that animal populations could make collective decisions and act in coordinated ways to respond to environmental challenges. And they had created an opportunity for human societies to reimagine what cities could be when they stopped viewing themselves as battlegrounds against nature and started viewing themselves as potential habitats for a diversity of life. The story of the rats leaving the cities became, in retrospect, one of the crucial turning points in how human society understood its relationship to the environment. It was not the only factor in the growing environmental movement, or in the gradually increasing recognition that human civilization needed to become less destructive and more integrative with natural systems. But it was a particularly vivid and visible symbol of what transformation was possible, of how a problem that had seemed intractable could be solved through a shift in perspective, and of how the presence of non-human intelligence and agency could force humans to reconsider their assumptions and practices. The academic field of animal ethics, which had previously been something of a niche discipline, suddenly became central to discussions of environmental policy and urban planning. Philosophers published papers questioning the basis for human dominance over other species. They explored questions about the rights and interests of non-human animals. They asked whether humans had obligations to other creatures and what those obligations might entail. The work that had been done by animal rights activists for decades suddenly became mainstream, incorporated into policy discussions and urban planning processes. Environmental justice scholars noted that the cities that had embraced ecological urbanism most thoroughly were also the ones that had most successfully addressed issues of environmental racism. The pollution that had historically been concentrated in poor neighborhoods and neighborhoods of color began to decrease as the focus shifted away from industrial-scale pest control chemicals and toward more integrated ecological management. Parks and green space began to be equitably distributed across neighborhoods, rather than being concentrated in wealthy areas. The benefits of the rat absence and the subsequent rewilding were not equally distributed gentrification, and displacement continued to be serious problems, but there was at least the possibility of equitable distribution, which hadn't existed before. There was also a curious historical irony in the story. The rats had come to cities as stowaways, as accidental colonizers, as creatures that had benefited from human settlement and human civilization. They had thrived in the urban environment and had become so integral to urban life that their absence was immediately noticeable and disruptive. And then, by making a collective decision that the cities were no longer habitable, they had forced the humans who lived there to reimagine what cities could be. It was as though the rats, in their leaving, had performed a crucial service for the species that had driven them out. It was as if the rats, in retreating, had performed a crucial service. They had been the problem that, when solved, revealed that the real issue wasn't the rats themselves, but the approach that humans had been taking to urban life and urban management. By withdrawing, they had created the space for a new paradigm to emerge, one that was less about control and eradication, and more about coexistence and adaptation, one that acknowledged the possibility of sharing urban space with other creatures and other forms of life. Decades later, when historians and environmental scholars looked back on the period of urban transformation that followed the rats' leaving, they would identify it as a crucial moment of change in human history. It was the point at which human civilization began, however haltingly and imperfectly, to recognize that there might be ways of organizing urban space that were less hostile to the non-human world. It was the moment when cities began to imagine themselves as ecosystems rather than as machines or battlegrounds. It was the beginning of a long and difficult process of learning to build and live in ways that acknowledge the presence and the value of the non-human world. The rats, ironically, had not truly left the cities entirely. Some had remained in rural and peri-urban areas, living in the agricultural spaces that surrounded urban centers, feeding on grain and crops. Small populations persisted in the wilds beyond the city limits, in forests and wild places where they could live according to their nature. Occasionally, individual rats or small populations would venture back into cities, seeking the reliable food sources and shelter that urban environments continued to offer. But they were no longer the dominant force they had once been. They had receded from the center of the urban ecosystem, and in doing so, they had allowed other forms of life to flourish and other ways of thinking about cities to emerge. Environmental scientists noted with interest that the retreat of the rats seemed to have been permanent, or at least, it showed no signs of reversing despite the passage of many decades. The conditions that would have previously drawn millions of rats to cities remained largely the same. Food was still available, shelter could still be found, the infrastructure for rat survival was still present. The improved pest control and sealed containers would have slowed rat reestablishment, but they wouldn't have made it impossible. Yet the rats did not return. The collective decision that had been made at the moment of their departure seemed to be held firm across generations. Some researchers theorized that the decision had become encoded in rat culture, passed down from mothers to offspring, as an understanding that cities were no longer suitable habitats, that the risks were too great, that the potential for survival was too low. Others suggested that the memory of the intense pest control campaigns had been so traumatic at a species level that it had created a permanent fear of urban environments, a deep ancestral memory of danger. Still others proposed more speculative theories involving epigenetic changes or shifts in the neurochemistry of rat populations that made urban living psychologically intolerable, that had somehow rewired the rat brain to avoid cities. The truth was that nobody knew exactly why the rats had left, or why they didn't return. The phenomenon remained one of the great mysteries of contemporary natural history, unsolved despite numerous research efforts and significant scientific resources devoted to understanding it. But for the human inhabitants of cities, the mechanism mattered less than the outcome. The rats had gone, the cities had been transformed, and life had become in many ways more livable, more diverse, and more complex. The lessons of the rat's departure extended far beyond cities. As environmental consciousness grew, and the mechanisms of climate change and ecological degradation became increasingly visible and impossible to ignore, societies around the world began to grapple with questions that the rat story had raised in vivid and immediate terms. How should humans coexist with non-human life? What alternatives existed to the constant struggle for dominance and control? How could civilization be reorganized to be less destructive and more integrative? What would it mean to build societies that honored the intelligence and agency of non-human creatures? These questions didn't have easy answers. The process of implementing the insights from the rat story was messy and complicated, involving compromises, failures, and constant renegotiation. But the existence of the rat story provided a tangible example of what transformation was possible. A creature that had been despised and targeted for elimination had, through collective action and intelligence, simply walked away from the conflict. In doing so, it had forced the human inhabitants of cities to confront the limitations of their approach and to imagine something different. The cities that had been shaped by the rat problem for so long found themselves, in the absence of rats, free to be shaped by different values and different visions. The opportunity for transformation was seized, at least in some places, at least to some degree. And the results, while imperfect and incomplete, suggested that there were indeed alternatives to the particular form of urban civilization that the 20th century had produced. Social movements began to emerge based on the principles that had been developed through ecological urbanism. There was the slow cities movement, which advocated for urban development that prioritized quality of life over economic growth. There was the transition towns movement, which worked toward building communities that were more resilient and less dependent on global supply chains. There was the commons-based urbanism movement, which sought to create cities where resources were held in common and managed collectively. All of these movements drew inspiration and validation from the example of the rat departure and the urban transformation that had followed. Urban agriculture began to transform cities in profound ways. Vacant lots that had previously been used for dumping or that had simply been abandoned were converted into community gardens and small farms. Rooftop gardens that had initially been novelties became standard practice. Urban forests grew as trees were planted systematically throughout neighborhoods. The food miles required to feed urban populations began to decrease as more food was produced locally. Cities began to become more self-sufficient, less dependent on distant agricultural regions for their sustenance. The economic implications of this transformation were significant. Local farmers' markets multiplied. Small farms on the outskirts of cities became profitable again. Urban gardeners began to sell excess produce to restaurants and consumers. New jobs were created in ecological restoration, in urban agriculture, in green infrastructure design and maintenance. The economy became somewhat more localized, less concentrated in the hands of a few large corporations. Political structures began to shift as well. Community boards gained more power in determining how neighborhoods would develop. Participatory budgeting processes allowed residents to vote on how public funds would be allocated. Environmental justice became a central concern in urban planning. The voices of communities that had historically been marginalized began to be heard more clearly in the processes that shaped cities. In the end, the story of the rats and the cities they left behind was a story about the possibility of change. It was about the recognition that what had seemed fixed and permanent, the inevitability of urban decay, the necessity of the rat problem, the requirement for absolute dominance over the natural world, was actually contingent and changeable. It was about the insight that intelligence and agency were not uniquely human properties, and that non-human animals might have something to teach us about how to live differently, about how to survive, in the face of overwhelming odds about when to fight and when to retreat, and when to reimagine the entire nature of the conflict. The rats had left the cities, and in leaving they had returned something to the humans who lived there. The possibility of imagining cities differently, of building societies that could accommodate both human needs and non-human flourishing, of creating a world that was less about winning wars of control and more about learning to live together in complexity and with respect. It was, in the end, a gift one that had come in the form of an absence, that had required loss and adjustment to receive, but that had ultimately been transformative. The post-rat cities were different places from the cities that had gone before, and most people who lived in them believed that, on balance, they were better places to live, more beautiful, more just, more alive in the truest sense of that word. The story of the rats would be told and retold, would become part of the mythology of the 21st century, would be referenced in environmental policy debates and urban planning discussions for generations to come. It would be studied in philosophy classes and cited in animal ethics papers. It would inspire artists and writers and filmmakers. It would become a touchstone, a story that captured something essential about human potential for change and for learning from the non-human world. And in cities around the world, in parks that had been created where wastelands had been, in the songs of birds returning to urban spaces, in the laughter of children playing freely on grass and under trees, in the restored rivers and wetlands and the slowly recovering ecosystems, the legacy of the rats' departure lived on. The cities had learned, through the departure of their most hated residents, to imagine themselves differently. And in that reimagining lay the seeds of countless possibilities for a better, more integrated, more just relationship between human civilization and the living world.